On the Foster Ranch, 75 miles northwest of Roswell, Mac Brazel, a farmhand, was on his daily rounds when he came across some strange material scattered in the fields. His sheep refused to go near it. Unable to identify what it was, Brazel travelled 20 miles to show his nearest neighbour what he had found. Loretta Proctor is 83 and still lives on the same ranch near Corona, north of Roswell. She remembers Brazel arriving on horseback with a collection of strange material.
He showed us this piece that looked like plastic or wood of some kind, and he said that there was some metallic-looking stuff that when you crushed it, it just straightened right back out. It wouldn't stay crushed. And there was some beams or something that he said had kind of pinkish purple printing on it. Well, we told him it's probably a UFO and he should report it.
Brazel took her advice and travelled into Roswell town with the strange debris. He reported his find to the sheriff of Chavez County. Sheriff George Wilcox immediately notified the local airbase. Roswell Army Airfield was home to the 509, America's elite bomb group which had dropped the atomic bomb on Japan. As the only atomic bomb squadron in the world, it was surrounded by the highest levels of security and secrecy. The 509's air intelligence officer was Major Jesse Marcel. He was assigned to investigate the material that the rancher had brought in. Marcel drove out to Brazel's ranch to collect some of the debris. That night, he brought it back to his house to show his wife and son.
He came back real late one night, about 2 o'clock in the morning, as I recall, very excited because he woke myself, my mother up, saying they found parts of a UFO, or a flying saucer at that time. And he wanted me to see it because it was such of an unusual type of finding.
In 1947, he was 12 years old, but he vividly remembers the extraordinary nature of the material he saw that night in Roswell.
As I recall, the most unusual part of the debris that I saw was the I-beam fragments, or what I recall as being I-beam, because they were very light, very strong, and they had some writing along the inside surface of this. And that was the thing that really set this apart from anything I'd ever seen before.
Dan Dwyer and his colleagues in the Roswell Fire Brigade were also involved. The firemen were shown some remarkable material with curious properties. Dwyer's daughter Frankie was in the station at the time and remembers picking it up.
When I would wad it up, it was like I had nothing in my hand. I couldn't feel it touching my skin. It was real weird. Drop it on the table and it was just like water, the way it would spread out.
Meanwhile, Major Marcel brought the material he'd recovered back to Roswell Army Airfield. The commanding officer, Colonel Butch Blanchard, surprisingly ordered his public information officer, First Lieutenant Walter Hort, to issue an astonishing statement to the press.
I was instructed by Colonel Blanchard to put out a press release which in effect stated that we had in our possession a flying saucer. In essence, it said that we have in our possession a flying disc. It was picked up on a ranch, and I can't remember if I said northwest of Roswell, brought into town by Mac Brazel, a ranch foreman, and the material was flown to higher headquarters, 8th Air Force, General Ramey.
It was an announcement that stunned the world. The London Daily Telegraph reported that although no details were given of the craft, the Air Force claimed that it was of a flimsy construction, like a box kite. A small town in America had become the center of the world's attention.
There was a tremendous amount of excitement because here I am, a little country editor in a small city in New Mexico, talking to Paris and Rome and London and Tokyo, and I can't remember all of them, spent the whole afternoon on the phone. And I know that my counterparts at the other Roswell paper and probably at the radio stations did the same. But there was a lot of excitement.
America was transfixed. Radio networks issued hourly bulletins. This is an actual broadcast of the time.
Headline edition, July 8, 1947. The Army Air Forces has announced that a flying disc has been found and is now in the possession of the Army. Army officers say the missile, found sometime last week, has been inspected at Roswell, New Mexico, and sent to Wright Field, Ohio, for further inspection. Russia has demanded UN action to get all...
Major Marcel had flown samples of the material to Fort Worth, Texas, headquarters of the 8th Air Force. Here, the story would take a remarkable turn. General Roger Ramey, the commanding officer there, called a press conference in his office. In front of photographers, he invited Major Marcel to display the material he had brought from Roswell. The base duty weather officer was also ordered to attend so that he could give his verdict to the press as to precisely what Marcel was holding in his hands.
The general called and said, "Get your ass over here to my office. We got something here we want you to look at." And aye, sir. And he says, "If you've got a car, fine. If you haven't, get one. Get the first means of transportation and get over to my office." And when I saw that, I said, "Is that your flying saucer?" And they said, "Yeah." And I said, "Well, hell no. That's a Raywin target and balloon. And if it isn't," I said, "I'd eat it without salt or pepper. I know what that is." "Are you sure?" "Yes, I'm sure. I know what that is."
This is what I would like to show you. In here, this is the photograph of the debris that was seen in General Ramey's office at Carswell Air Force Base in Fort Worth, Texas. This is my father holding up what is very obviously parts of radar target with balloon debris. In here you see balsa wood fragments. You have actually parts of the balloon envelope in of itself, and you have what looks like paperback metal foil. And to emphasize this, this is not what was seen on the floor of our kitchen that evening or that late early morning hours in 1947. This is totally different.
The implication is that Major Marcel may have been ordered to take part in a cover-up that involved switching the material from Roswell for a common weather balloon. General Ramey and the Air Force now discounted their earlier press announcements that they had found a flying saucer. The story was officially dead. But back in Roswell, those who had reported the original story found that the military were behaving somewhat strangely over what they now claimed was merely a weather balloon. Frank Joyce had been the first to announce the original news of the flying saucer at local radio station KGFL just a few hours earlier.
I got a phone call. Well, I got a number of phone calls, but the one that really got my attention was purportedly from the Pentagon. There was a young lady on the line saying, "Colonel so-and-so, this is the Pentagon calling." And this was within a few minutes of it going out on the wire. And the voice on the line says, "Who is this?" I tell him. He said, "You put that story on the air about the flying saucers?" And I mean, his voice was, you know, the type that really conveys menace and power. And I said, "Yes, I did." And he says, "You're going to get in a lot of trouble for this," or made some threatening comment. And I said, "Look, I'm a civilian. You can't talk to me this way. You can't treat me this way. You can't tell me what to do in stories I put on the air." And he says, "I'll show you what I can do." And bang, hung up the phone.
And the voice at the other end of the line showed exactly the power that he had to the owner of the radio station.
I got a call from Washington from one of the offices of one of the senators saying, "Look, if you put out any stories on this thing, you're going to lose your license. And it's not going to be over a period of time. It's going to be the same day that we tell you that you're off the air."
Frankie Rowe, the fireman's daughter who had handled some material, had always regarded the Air Force in Roswell as friends of the town. But an unexpected visit from the military to her home would now cast the Air Force in a sinister new light.
He had this club or stick or whatever it was, and he was beating it on his hand. And he would hit it. Every time he would say something, he'd hit his hand. And he said, "I want you to know you were never there." I didn't understand what he meant, because I said, "Yes, I was." And he said, no, you weren't. I said, yes, I was. And he said, can't you get this through your head? You never saw anything. You were not there. You don't know anything. And he said, you know, this is a big desert out here. We can just take you out in the middle of this desert and no one will ever find your bodies. He said, you'll be nothing but bones and nobody will ever know what happened to you. And I told him I would not talk about it.
Of course, they had a whole flock of microphones there. They wanted me they wanted some comments from me, but I wasn't at liberty to do that. So all I could do is keep my mouth shut. And General Ramey is the one who discussed, told the newspapers, I mean the newsmen, what it was and to forget about it. It was nothing more than a weather observation balloon. Of course, which we both knew differently. We left Roswell perhaps around 3:30 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. As you can see, it's flat. It is very difficult. In fact, with just verbal directions, we never would have found it. We had to follow the rancher out there. The following morning, we went out to the site where the crash was. And what I saw, I couldn't believe there was so much of it. It was scattered over such a vast area. So we proceeded to pick up as much of the debris as we could, loaded in a wagon. We filled that up. It took us a good part of the day to do that, because it was such small fragments that we had to do a lot of picking. We found a piece of metal about a 1.5 to 2 feet wide and about 2 or 3 feet long. Felt like you had nothing in your hands. It wasn't any thicker than the foil out of a pack of cigarettes. But the thing about that got me is that you couldn't even bend it. You couldn't bend it. Even with a sledgehammer would bounce off of it. So I knew that I had never seen anything like that before. And as of now, I don't know what it was. It was not anything from this earth that I'm quite sure of. Because I was, being an intelligence officer, I was familiar with just about all materials used in aircraft and in our air travel. This is nothing like that. It could not be. It could not have been.
It's Carlene Green, and I live here in Roswell. My father was in the Air Force, and he was stationed here at Roswell at the time in '47. He was assigned as part of the cleanup crew out at the site. He had the highest security clearance that the Air Force gives, but he was never able, nor did he ever attempt to discuss the incident. He passed away in 1988. He had his last tour of duty was in Vietnam, where he acquired Agent Orange, ended up with cancer of the spine. He did not want to die at home. He wanted to die in a military hospital. And as he was laying on the gurney waiting to be loaded into the ambulance, he told me, he said, baby, he said, the story is true. He said, don't let anybody try to tell you any different. He said, the incident happened. There was a spacecraft. He said there were graves out there. And I kissed him, and that's the last I got to talk to my dad. But he was very committed gentleman. His love was for the service and his family, and he did his best to take care of both. What he told me, I believe with all my heart. There is no doubt in my mind.
My name is Larry Roulette. I'm the son of Carl Roulette, who was a sergeant in the Air Force. And my dad and I's relationship was, I can't say it was an excellent relationship, but it was a good relationship. We never had any big problems or anything. I was in the late 80s, and I was talking to my dad we were out in his shop, and we kind of got into a conversation about it then. And that's when he let me know that he had been on the cleanup crew that went out to pick up the crash site in 1947. So we kind of got into it. You know, he didn't want to really, you had to pry things out of him, and it was hard to do, but he was sick back then too, I believe, so I don't know. But he told me about the grays. Said he got out there and then turned around, and all of a sudden there was 3 of them laying there, you know. So they bundled them up and took them back to the dispensary on the base. After they got out here and they found out they were in over their heads out here, they flew them to Dallas-Fort Worth. And from there they went to the Little Pentagon, which is Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. He told me it would be best if I didn't tell anybody. And then he said, you know, that the government had told them when this incident happened that the government had come to them or gathered them all up, the ones that was out there, and told them that they were not to say anything about this. And they threatened them with their pensions, threatened them with their lives, threatened them with their families' lives. Word came out that they told them that it was a big desert out there and you could be put in places you'd never be found if you talked about it.
I'm Pat Bush, and I was married to George Bush, the brother of Miriam. And her name was Miriam Titus whenever I knew her. She worked at the hospital, at the base hospital. She was an executive secretary there, had a high security rating. The head of the hospital there came to her one evening or one afternoon and said, I think there's something you would like to see. And he took her down to the surgical suite or whatever it was in the hospital where they had brought these beings, and they took her into the room and she saw them. They wouldn't let her get close to them, but she stood by the doorway and looked at them. As she was looking at them, one of them moved its middle finger on its hand. The hand moved. So it was, whatever it was living at that time. She went home that evening, and she was excited about what she had seen, and she sat at the dinner table and told the family what she had seen and what they had told her had happened. And they were all interested and asked questions, and the next day when she came in from work, she was very somber, and she just told them, don't ever mention what I told you, and don't ever ask me anything about it. And she was very frightened. I felt very sorry for her because she lived a very frightened life, because they had told her not to ever speak of it again and what the consequences would be. And she was frightened her whole life long about it. She passed away in this unusual way, and we started kind of looking at things and talking to people and realizing that many of the other people that were involved in it had died mysterious deaths or disappearances. She was in a motel, and she was not registered at the motel under her name. It was registered under her sister's name, which is very strange, and her sister didn't know she was there. The authorities came in because it was the sister's name and address on the registration. They called her home, and then she knew that her sister had passed away. When the police came and everything, they said that it had to be a suicide. that the door was locked from inside. Like nobody could lock the door from the inside. And, you know, it was all kind of, it just skimmed over the top of it. You know, they didn't go into any research, try to find out anything about her. It just, I just don't believe that she killed herself. I think somebody else did it. There was something that was being covered up, and evidently something important enough that they would kill to keep it a secret.
Is the gentleman to whom we have referred, the mortician, Glenn Dennis. In 1947, he was manager of Ballard Funeral Home in Roswell. Those telephone calls from the base hospital on July 8th started a chain of events leading to threats against his own life and the reported death of a close friend. Let's go back now to the afternoon of July 8th.
Then the next call I got, probably in 30, 45 minutes later, he was asking me then about our preparations and what we did preparing the bodies that had been laying out in the elements, or that, you know, some badly decomposed bodies, or how we treated the burnt bodies, otherwise very traumatic cases, and what our procedure was on that. Then the next question was, well, what would you do where you wouldn't change any of the chemical contents, you wouldn't destroy any of the blood, you wouldn't destroy anything? That might be very important later on, you know, down the road. What would your process and what you do and the chemicals that you use, would that change the blood contents and everything? I knew at the time that there was something that probably happened. I thought maybe it was something that they weren't ready to release, or that might be some VIP or something they didn't want. But I mean, I had no idea what it was. But I told him at the time, I said, you know, I can come out and I can help you if you have that. And he said, no, this is for future, in case this should happen in the future. He said, this is something we need to know so we'll know how to proceed.
Questions about chemicals, tissue, and the preservation of blood, as well as other body fluids. Very strange questions. If doctors at the base were examining the remains at the time of those telephone calls, it follows that by July 8th, the bodies had been removed from the second crash site to the base hospital. That would match key points in the story told by Sergeant Brown.
Not only that, but Glenn Dennis' story tends to corroborate the story told by witness Frankie Rowe.
Now, he felt that the one that was alive, he said later that it was taken out to the base hospital. And a friend of ours, her husband was working out there at the time, and he saw the one person walk in.
Later that same afternoon, Glenn Dennis drove an injured airman to the base hospital following a minor automobile accident. Walking into the emergency room, Dennis saw debris in the back of a parked Army ambulance.
What I noticed that was so unusual about this, that there was some inscriptions or border around this part of it. That was probably 3 inches, maybe around 3 inches, but it was kind of going along the contour of the wreckage. And at the time, after I got back, I got to thinking about this and what the border looked like, and it kind of reminded me, reminded me of an Egyptian inscriptions of figures and whatever.
Now another piece in our jigsaw puzzle drops into place. It appears doctors were continuing their examinations of the bodies as Mr. Dennis entered the emergency room. Assisting them was a nurse, whom he describes as a close friend.
One of the nurses, lieutenant nurses that I was acquainted with very well, she was very excited, and she said, "How did you get in here? What are you doing here? And get out immediately or you're going to get in a lot of trouble." She said, "Get out of here as fast as you can."
The nurse disappeared into another room, presumably where the examination was still in progress. But serious trouble was in store for Glenn Dennis, the result of a chance remark to an officer who stopped him as he was leaving.
But I said, it looks like you've had a crash. I said, I see some debris and then the ambulance is there. And that's probably where I really got in trouble right there. And he said, well, just a moment. And then he went to the door and he motioned for somebody, and about that time there was 2 MPs that came out. They both, and he said, get this man out here, get him out here as fast as you can get him out of here. And then we were starting down the hall, and then there was a man that we heard a voice said, I'm not through with that SOB yet, said, bring him back. So,
Mr. Dennis says suddenly he was rushed into a room where he was confronted by 2 men he had never seen before, an Army sergeant and a captain with red hair. A sharp exchange followed, in which Dennis says both men threatened to kill him.
The captain told me, the red-headed captain told me, he said, there was no crash here, you did not see anything, and he said, you don't go into town, you don't tell anybody anything that you saw anything or anything else. He said, if you do, you will get in real serious trouble. Well, I was a little agitated because I didn't like the name he called me to start with. And I informed him, I said, look, I'm a civilian, you can't do a damn thing to me, and as far as I'm concerned, you can go to hell. And that was the exact words that I told him, and I remember it very clearly. And then the black sergeant, he said, oh, don't kid yourself, young man. He said, somebody be picking your bones out of the sand.
Army Air Force Captain O.W. Henderson kept his mouth shut for a long time. He didn't go public until he learned that some of the others had broken their silence. He was retired by then and living in California.
It had been rumored for years that one of the pilots on one of the flights out of Roswell had actually seen the bodies. But the rumor did not become a reality until 1982, when Pappy Henderson finally spoke out. He told his wife, I've been dying to tell you for years.
We were in the grocery store in San Diego, where we had lived for many years, and we were at the checkout stand, and here was a paper, the Globe, I believe it was. Here was all of the story about it. In fact, I still have the papers here. And he said, he took a look, and he said, I've been wanting to tell you about this for years. I guess if they're putting in the papers now, it's no longer a top secret. And he said, he bought the papers, and we went to the car, and he said, read those. And I read the article, and he said, it's a true story. He said, not only did I know about it, but I'm the pilot that took the crashed saucer to Dayton, Ohio. I was astonished, and if it hadn't been Pappy telling me, I probably wouldn't have believed it. But he was very confident, and he was always very truthful and straightforward. So I believed him, but you know, in those days, if you said you'd seen a spacecraft or a flying saucer, you were put in the annals of a nut. So we didn't say much about this, but years before, when people would ask him what he thought about flying saucers, his answer was, there's something to it.
We may never identify and confirm all the witnesses, but let's review the ones we've heard about so far. These are people who claim they saw bodies of humanoid creatures killed in the Roswell crash. We have an Army pilot, a civil engineer, an archaeologist, and a sergeant who peeked under a tarp. 2 of our purported witnesses allegedly made deathbed statements. The woman dying of cancer told her story to a nurse at a hospital in Florida. And for the last 4 days of his life, Sergeant Melvin Brown talked about the crash, insisting the bodies were real and the weather balloon story was a lie.
What on the earth could he have done that he would have been so worried about on his deathbed? Because he was worried about it. I mean, he was mentioning this place in his sleep and sort of shaking his head and nodding and arguing in his sleep about it and mentioning it. He was worried about it. Whatever it was, he was really worried. And this is what makes me angry. It makes me rather bitter to think that, all right, I don't know, UFOs, alien bodies, I don't know what the truth is. All I know is that if my dad said so, then that's it. He wouldn't have lied.
During our investigation of the Roswell crash, we located a witness who claimed to have watched a bright light cross the sky and fall to Earth the night of July 2nd, 1947. His name is William Woody, and he still lives on the same small farm outside Roswell, New Mexico, where, as a boy, he says he and his father watched a burning light slowly flying northwest toward the desert.
My dad looked up and said, "My God, what's that bright light there?" And we got looking, and it looked like a falling star at that time, but we got to checking it, and it was much larger, much closer. And we looked at the picture of it. Well, it just showed much larger and much closer, and just a large stream of white light with a reddish tail on it.
Woody's father drove out to the desert several days later, trying to find the spot where the light came down. Woody went along, but they found the roads blocked off by military guards.
No, they had several of the side roads, which there's not, in that area, not too many access roads off, which there's many more now than there was back in that time. But every one that we come to, they had a security set up so you wouldn't go off in that area to the left-hand side of the road going north.
Far out. How strange it seems that 9 airplanes and numerous crates and packages marked top secret would be needed to transport what was left of a weather balloon. One flight on the 6th of July moved debris from Roswell to 8th Air Force Headquarters and on to Washington, D.C. July 8th, Roswell to Wright Field near Dayton, Ohio, which is now Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. That same day, a plane arrived in Roswell from Washington. The crew picked up a sealed box containing debris. And another flight was flown from Roswell to Fort Worth, all on the 8th of July. The day after General Ramey's news conference, special flights were still going out. 3 on the 9th of July to Los Alamos. 1 more that day from Roswell to Fort Worth. And on the 10th, a flight departed Wright Field in Ohio for an unknown destination.
Apparently, debris was being shipped out from Roswell as rapidly as it could be recovered and brought to the base. But what about the bodies? What happened to them?
We can trace the recovery of the bodies from the actual crash site to the base hospital at Roswell. The pathologist, Dr. Johnson, who did the preliminary examination of the bodies, filed a report, a preliminary autopsy report, of which we have no records. In fact, all the records from Roswell went to Washington. No paper trail whatsoever have we been able to uncover from Roswell.
Dr. Johnson is now deceased, but in attempting to research his background, Don and Kevin made a startling discovery. All records of the late doctor's military service, indeed most of his career, had vanished.
According to the ABMS Medical Compendium of Medical Specialists, Dr. Johnson completed his internship in 1946. Yet in 1947, when we can document his being at Roswell, there is absolutely no mention of that fact. In 1948, he is listed as a pathologist practicing in Galveston. In 1949, until going into private practice, he is listed at numerous hospitals throughout the country. Each hospital that we contacted has absolutely no records of Dr. Johnson being on staff.
If an autopsy was performed on one or more of the bodies, no one has ever been able to find the report, not even using the Freedom of Information Act. However, this man claims to have spoken with a doctor who dissected the alien bodies.
The medical person he had reference to had information about the anatomy of the alien, the dead alien that was taken from a crashed disc.
He is Leonard Stringfield, the retired marketing director of a large chemical company. Stringfield has devoted more than 20 years to investigating and writing about UFO phenomena. He specializes in suspected crashes and retrievals.
The head is large, very large by human proportion. There is no hair follicles. There are no earlobes. There is no nose as we have as human. The mouth is just a slit or an orifice which goes in about approximately an inch, membranous, which leads to no digestive tract or alimentary system. There were no red cells, no lymphocytes. There were no striatum muscles in the body. There was an atria, or a heart, the pumping station, so to speak, for the colorless liquid, which is, in a sense, blood.
After the Roswell crash, dozens of soldiers and others connected with the military were pressured never, under any circumstances, ever to speak of the incident again. Accounts surfacing only now, more than 40 years later, indicate the tactics used to enforce secrecy were ruthless. Which brings us back to the witness we mentioned just a few moments ago, the friend of the mortician, the Army nurse.
And this was a young second lieutenant, had only been in the service less than 3 months and commissioned less than 3 months. Very deeply religious lady. She was born and raised in a very strict Catholic family, attended all the private Catholic schools, preschool and high schools, and her folks wanted her to become a nun, but she...
At Mr. Dennis' request, we've agreed not to use her real name, but we will call the nurse Judy. Sensitive and deeply religious. What she saw in the examining room July 8th, 1947, took Judy to the brink of hysteria.
And she said, "I can't believe what I've just seen." She said, "This was the most horrible thing I've ever seen in my life." She was going into this examination room that was across the hall. She was going in to get some supplies, and when she walked in the door, there was 2 doctors there. And she noticed a horrible smell immediately. But she saw these 2 doctors, and they said, "We need you." She started out the door and said, "You stay here, we've got to have you." And what it was, they were examining, she told me, 3 bodies, foreign bodies. And she said 2 of them were very mutilated.
According to Mr. Dennis, Judy and both doctors became ill from the stench of the bodies as they continued to examine them. Judy was still not well the following day when Glenn met her for lunch at the officers' club. But he was more disturbed by her emotional state.
I knew she was almost in a state of shock, because she said it was so gruesome and so horrible, and she would just, almost grab her head, and it looked like she was just going into total shock.
We should note here that Glenn's concern for Judy was serious. Marriage had been discussed, but all of that was about to change forever. He never dreamed what lay in store for Judy as she began to describe what she had seen.
She had drawn me just a little the night before. She had a description of an arm that was that she had drawn, and then the anatomy of the arm, which was different from ours. There was only 4 fingers on the hand. Didn't have a thumb to it. Only 4 very slim, fragile little fingers. But when they turned one of the hands over, they noticed at the end of the fingers there was like little pads on each one of the 4 fingers there. And it looked to them like they were like little suction cups. They were little hollowed out areas that looked kind of like a suction cup. The heads on these individuals were much larger, somewhat larger than the human head would be. The eyes were very sunken. The nose was there wasn't a convex or anything. The nose was very concave with only 2 little orifices. The ears, there was no ear. There only might be 2 little orifices on the side, but very small little lobes that looked like they might function, might close maybe or whatever, but they was very small. Nothing resembled an ear on a human anatomy at all.
Not touching their food, they continued to talk. But for Judy and Glenn, time was running out.
She never touched her food at all, we never, I think I drank my Coke, but I was so, I thought, my God, this was something else, and I don't know that I ever ate my food either, but that was then. She said, "I've got to go back to the barracks." He said, "I am deathly ill and I've got to go back to the barracks," and then that was the last time I ever saw her.
Now we return to Glenn Dennis and the story of his friend Judy, the Army nurse. Remember, it was Judy who told Glenn she assisted 2 doctors examining bodies of humanoid creatures brought to the base hospital. According to Mr. Dennis, she described the bodies in detail and even drew sketches. After lunch with Glenn, Judy left the officers' club and vanished.
The next day, I called out. I wanted to see how she was doing and how she was feeling. And of course, by that time I was really fascinated by what was going on, and I was so curious I wanted, you know, maybe she'd feel like talking a little more about it. But I was really concerned on what was happening to her. And they told me that she wasn't working, that she was unavailable that day. And so the next day I made the call again. I made 2 or 3 calls the next day. And it was also, she was still unavailable. Then the third day I called and they said that she'd been transferred out. And they didn't know where, but she was no longer there at the air base.
Transferred without a word, no goodbyes, and no explanations. Judy was a second lieutenant with less than 4 months at Roswell, her first duty assignment. For days, Glenn kept asking questions, but got no answers.
Well, then about maybe 10 days to 2 weeks or so later, I get a letter from her in the mail addressed to the funeral home. And all it was just inside with just a note said, I can't write, I don't have time to write now, but here's an APO number that you can send me the mail to. And that was all that was in the envelope. There wasn't anything else.
APO numbers are used by the military to forward mail to American servicemen and women without disclosing their locations. But through friends at the base, Glenn quickly learned the APO number sent by Judy meant that her letter originated in England. He replied immediately, then waited.
Probably 2 weeks, or maybe it was at least 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks later, the letter that I had sent to her with the APO number was returned to me, and on the envelope it said, return to sender, and then it had a big red print said deceased. And that was the last time I heard or, you know, even thought about it. And then about every time I'd go to the base too, sometimes we wouldn't go there for a week or two on emergencies or whatever, but 2 or 3 weeks or so later I would go out to base and I said, has anyone heard from the lieutenant? And one of the nurses says, well, the rumor is that she is in England. Well, in her note, she also told me, she said, I am in London. And then the nurses told me that she was in London. The rumor is that she was on maneuvers on a training mission with 5 other nurses, and they went down on a plane. And they understand the rumor was that they were all killed in a plane crash.
Later on, another key person in the Roswell mystery was reported killed in a plane crash. He was Lieutenant Colonel Payne Jennings, executive officer of the 509th Bomb Group. And finally, there was the curious accident which claimed the life of a soldier believed to have worked at one of the crash sites.
We have information concerning a heavy equipment operator, for example, that was found crushed to death by his own vehicle, with his unscathed glasses found 100 feet from the site.
The Roswell Crash. Even after years of research, 100 questions still come to mind, most without answers.
Good morning. I hope you'll pardon me. I'm a little bit nervous. My name is Charles L. Brown. I'm a Lieutenant Colonel, U.S. Air Force, retired, subsequently 7 years with the Foreign Service. I like the name Charlie Brown. A gentleman by the name of Charles Schultz, of great talent, sort of elevated the name, if you will. During World War II, I was a young farm boy from West Virginia. I got the patriotic bug, joined the United States Army, ended up flying bombers in Europe, and ended the war transport in the Pacific. Finished college in the late summer of '49, recalled to active duty in the newly formed United States Air Force. I was assigned to an organization called Office of Special Investigations. The Air Force, as most of you know, was formed in 1947. OSI, as a central investigative agency for the Air Force, was formed, I think, in 1948. So everything was relatively new. Needless to say, starting in '47, UFOs were rather new. The Air Force Air Technical Intelligence Center was at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and I had my office in a building adjacent to it. And our organization was the worldwide investigative agency for the Air Force for any unidentified flying objects. This lasted for about 2 years. The project name was known as Project Grudge. It was a predecessor to a project known as Blue Book, which Ed Ruppelt headed. During my experience with it, I would collect the data from, I didn't collect it, it was sent into my office. I analyzed it. As a pilot investigator, I was able to offer some bits of advice to the air technical intelligence people. Now, you might visualize a massive office, but as I recall, we had a first lieutenant, a secretary, and a technical sergeant. That was the essence of Project Blue Book when it started, or Project Grudge, Blue Book, and expanded somewhat. During the review as an analyst of these various documentary reports, if you will, or documents, I became clearly convinced that there was substance to what was being reported, in that we had ground visual, ground radar, airborne visual, and airborne radar confirmation of some of these sightings. The individuals who made the sightings were everything from airline pilots, military pilots, police officers, some of the people that your lives depend upon on a daily basis. These are very reputable and credible people. I hope that the testimony here from very credible people will convince you of that and will further Steve Greer's disclosure project, in that pressure needs to be brought to bring this to the attention not only of the Americans, but of people all over the planet. These vehicles have been seen and confirmed all over the planet. I am willing to sign a sworn statement or testify to my judgment and to what I have observed. Such things do exist. Please believe me. Please believe those who follow me. Thank you.